It started on a Wednesday. Quiet morning, sky hanging low with the scent of coming rain, and the lake as still as polished glass. Margaret Whitlow sat at the edge of the dock near her home, wearing her usual flannel shirt, soft jeans, and wide-brimmed canvas hat. She looked like someone's retired aunt, out for a breath of calm. Her old rod was propped gently in her lap, the same one her father had given her when she was 12. It wasn't fancy. The reel was taped at the base, and the grip had faded from sun and time. But it cast smooth and never snagged. The lake was why she'd bought the house in the first place. 12 years ago, she downsized from a 6-bedroom estate in Westchester to this modest 2-story home in Larkspur Glen, a pleasant, HOA-run community centered around Magnolia Lake. Upscale rural, the brochure said. A slice of peace. She didn't care for HOA politics, but the view was worth it. And she kept to herself, paid her dues, trimmed her hedges, never bothered a soul. That morning, she'd just reeled in her second sunfish and was about to toss it back when she heard it. The unmistakable click of stiff leather shoes on wood. "Ma'am," came a voice, tight and nasal. She turned slowly. A man in a golf shirt and khakis stood 10 feet away, clipboard in hand. His expression was all eyebrows and authority. "You're not permitted to fish here." Margaret blinked, thumbed the rim of her reel. "I'm sorry. This dock is common property, owned and regulated by the Homeowners Association. Fishing is only permitted from the community pier on the east bank." Margaret glanced down the shoreline. The community pier was a splintered platform no bigger than a picnic table, half blocked by reeds and built over a muddy slope. "I wasn't aware," she said gently. "I've been fishing here for years." "Well, now you are," he snapped, tapping his clipboard. "And you're in violation." She raised an eyebrow. "Of what exactly?" "Section 8B of the Neighborhood Agreement," he said. "Unauthorized personal use of natural resources under HOA regulation." Margaret smiled thinly. "That's quite a phrase." He didn't smile back. "You'll be fined $150. She blinked once. "For sitting quietly with a pole in the water?" "For breaking community policy," he corrected. "And if it happens again, the fine will increase. Noncompliance may result in formal legal action or HOA censure." Then he turned, strode back up the path like a mall cop on a mission. Margaret sat still for a moment, the line slack in the water. The fish had scattered. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. She reeled in slowly, laid the rod across her knees, and looked out over the lake. It was a small lake, 30 acres at most. Not grand, not famous. Just enough for geese in the winter and frogs in the spring. She'd watched deer drink from its shallows at dawn. Watched mist curl from its surface in October like whispered secrets. And now, according to a clipboard and a line buried in a packet she'd skimmed 12 years ago, it had been claimed. Regulated. Restricted. Margaret didn't go inside right away. She sat there for a long while, watching the water, thinking. The next morning, a paper envelope arrived on her doorstep. Official HOA letterhead. The fine was real. So was the threat. Pay within 14 days or face additional penalties. She read it once. Then she made tea. She didn't rage. Didn't call anyone. Didn't post online. That wasn't her way. Margaret wasn't the type to stir drama. But she was the type to ask questions. Especially the ones no one thought to ask. She pulled out her original HOA packet from the file cabinet in the guest room. Dug through the bylaws. The policies. The plat maps. Most of it was boilerplate. She flipped slowly. Page by page, paragraph by paragraph. And then, on a page near the back, beneath the description of common recreational features, she found something odd. A line in fine print. Lake access rights leased from Ridgeview Trust, expiring December 31st, 2024. She frowned. Ridgeview Trust. She'd never heard that name before. It wasn't the HOA. It wasn't the neighborhood developer. It was something else entirely. She went online. Found county land records. Searched property deeds. It took an hour, but there it was, clear as glass. Magnolia Lake wasn't owned by the HOA. It was leased. The land underneath it, and the water itself, belonged to a private trust that had held the rights since 1957. A family trust, mostly dormant, managed by a small law firm 2 counties over. And the lease? Set to expire in 10 months. Margaret leaned back in her chair, teacup cooling in her hand. They'd find her. On water they didn't own. She smiled. Not out of spite. Out of understanding. Because now, the quiet woman they thought they could bully had questions. And next, she'd have something even more powerful. Options. Margaret didn't tell anyone what she'd found. She didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, she folded the original HOA violation letter, tucked it back into its envelope, and slid it into the bottom drawer of her desk, right next to her father's pocketknife and the deed to the house she bought outright, in cash, 12 years earlier. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up a spreadsheet labeled Asset Holdings, Rural Properties, and scrolled. Slowly, carefully. To the rest of the world, Margaret Whitlow looked like someone who'd settled down quietly after retirement. A pleasant woman in her mid-60s who wore gardening gloves and smiled at neighbors. What the rest of the world didn't know, and never thought to ask, was that she wasn't retired. She'd just stopped explaining herself. For nearly 4 decades, Margaret had worked in asset recovery, specializing in distressed properties and forgotten land titles. She had built her first company from a second-hand laptop and a prepaid cell phone in a 1-bedroom apartment in Poughkeepsie. By the time she was 40, she was negotiating land development deals in 6 states and consulting for rural banking institutions. Her specialty? Finding value in places others ignored. Old floodplains, tax-defaulted parcels, expired mineral rights. All the overlooked corners where money sat waiting to be understood. She never wore suits, never went on television, but she read every contract like scripture and had a talent for spotting leverage in lines no one else saw. She sold her second company at 48 for $9.2 million. Bought a quiet house on a lake with no intention of ever needing to wear heels again. But the skills didn't go away. She just redirected them. She'd helped fund wildlife corridors in upstate forests. Bought land adjacent to small rural schools to prevent overdevelopment. Co-signed loans for young families through private trusts when banks said no. No one knew her name. That was how she liked it. So when the HOA fined her, not knowing that their legal authority extended no further than a lease quietly expiring in December, it wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was an invitation. Margaret spent the next 2 days in quiet research. She contacted the county registrar's office under a pseudonym, something she always did when gathering intel. Asked for copies of the Ridgeview Trust deed history. Dug through microfiche archives that had been scanned but never indexed. Located the law firm listed on the original deed. Harland & Crane, a boutique practice, specialized in estate law, mostly trust management. She called, spoke with an older paralegal who sounded grateful for company. Yes, Ridgeview Trust still exists, the woman confirmed. Only a few assets remain under it. Magnolia Lake is the largest, and it's privately owned. Margaret asked, yes, ma'am. Is the lease active? Until December 31st, yes. Have the current tenants renewed it? Not that I see here, the paralegal replied. There was an inquiry a few years ago. Nothing since. And the trust, is it accepting bids? The woman hesitated. Well, technically, they're not advertising it. But the trust's remaining heirs have expressed interest in liquidating. It's been a long process. Margaret's tone didn't change. Could you connect me with the trustee? The woman obliged. The next call took 20 minutes. Margaret listened more than she spoke. The trustee, a man named Ellis, late 70s, polite and direct, explained that the lake had been in the trust since his grandfather passed. No one in the family used it anymore. The HOA had leased the recreational rights for decades, but no one had checked in. They mailed their annual check, $1,100, every January, and that was that. No one from the board ever reached out. Margaret asked. Not once, he said. They just keep mailing the check and hoping we don't raise the rate. What's the sale price? He chuckled. You're the first to ask. We'd let it go for $400,000. Market value's probably double that, but we're ready to wrap things up. Margaret didn't flinch. I'll wire half by end of week. You'll have the other half at closing. There was a pause. Then, you're serious? Yes, she said. And I'd like the deal to be quiet. No listing. No press. No flags. He agreed. They hung up. She leaned back in her chair, fingers folded over her chest. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was ready. Because here's the thing about power. Most people assume it comes with noise. Titles. Announcements. Applause. But real power is silent. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply arrives and rewrites the rules from the inside out. By the following week, Margaret had wired the funds. The contract was signed, and for the first time in nearly 70 years, Magnolia Lake was about to change hands, not into the arms of the HOA that fined her, but into the calloused, capable hands of the woman they'd tried to shrink with a clipboard and a code book. She didn't tell them yet, not until the title cleared. That took 9 days. During that time, the HOA sent her another letter. This one was firmer in tone, warning her not to repeat her disregard for collective governance. She chuckled when she read it. Then she placed it neatly in a folder labeled, Evidence, Petty Tyranny. On the 10th day, the deed arrived. A crisp packet of notarized paper. Her name, in bold, Margaret Elaine Whitlow, sole owner of Magnolia Lake and waterway rights. She walked out to the dock that evening, the sun dipping low behind the pines, casting the lake in molten orange. She brought her rod, not to fish, to sit, to breathe, to listen to the quiet. Because soon, that quiet would be broken, not by her voice, but by a sign. One that would stand at the entrance of the neighborhood trail. White letters, blue background. Simple, legal, unmistakable. Private lake. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Owner, M.E. Whitlow. HOA access revoked as of January 1st, 2025. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The lake would do it for her. On January 1st, just as the sun rose and the cold morning mist curled over the surface of Magnolia Lake, a wooden post was driven into the ground. The soil was hard from the winter chill, but Margaret worked without complaint. She used a mallet older than some of the residents and wore a faded pair of gloves lined with fleece. The sign was simple, blue metal, white lettering, nothing fancy. She'd had it made 3 weeks ago and stored it in her garage, wrapped in burlap. The last bolt slid into place with a final satisfying click. She stood back, examined the angle, then tightened the post with a twist of her wrist. It was done. No press release. No town meeting. Just one sign. Clear, concise, and fully enforceable. Private lake. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Owner, M.E. Whitlow. HOA access revoked as of January 1st, 2025. The neighborhood was still asleep. She could hear a dog barking faintly, a coffee maker gurgling through someone's open kitchen window. Nothing in the air suggested a shift. But by noon, the ripple would begin. She returned home, brewed herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window facing the lake. Her cat, Audrey, curled at her feet. The old rod sat idle on its rack, glinting gently in the early sun. She didn't plan to fish that day. She didn't need to. The lake had already served its purpose, not as a place of sport, but as a mirror. A perfect, quiet reflection of a community that had forgotten itself. It was just after 9 a.m. when the first neighbor saw the sign. Jill Watson, HOA secretary, garden committee head, and unofficial busybody-in-chief, had taken her usual power walk around the perimeter path. She wore her neon jacket and earbuds, moving in quick, efficient strides. She stopped dead when she saw the sign. At first, she blinked, confused. She pulled out her phone, snapped a picture, then tapped furiously with both thumbs. Margaret assumed she was texting Howard Brenner, the HOA president. 10 minutes later, a second figure appeared on the path. Brenner himself. Stiff posture, steel gray hair, always in his HOA-issued vest. He approached the sign like it had personally insulted him, bent to inspect it, snapped more photos. Then, curiously, turned toward Margaret's house and stared. Not in anger, not yet, but with a confusion that looked very much like fear. Margaret didn't move from her chair. She simply lifted her teacup and nodded once through the window. By 10:30, 4 board members were on site. A mini-emergency meeting unfolded near the sign. Their voices rose in spurts, all theory and speculation. This must be a prank. She can't do this. We have an agreement. Margaret smiled quietly, because none of them understood yet. They had leased access. They had never owned the lake. And now, the lease was gone. Expired. Unrenewed. Unclaimed. She waited until 11:15 before stepping outside. Calm, unbothered, still in her cardigan and boots. She approached the group like she might a group of startled deer. "Everything all right?" she asked mildly. Brenner turned. His voice was a mixture of accusation and disbelief. "Margaret, what is the meaning of this?" She looked at the sign, then back at him. "I thought it was clear. You can't just put that up." "I can," she said evenly. "It's my lake." The silence hit like ice water. Jill's mouth actually dropped open. One of the younger board members, she thought his name was Tyler, blinked as if trying to reset the world. What are you talking about? Brenner asked, recovering. The HOA owns this lake. Margaret reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a neatly folded document, handed it to him. This is the title, she said. Filed and recorded. As of December 15th, Magnolia Lake and its associated land rights are privately owned by me through a direct acquisition of the Ridgeview Trust. Brenner skimmed the paper. His color shifted in waves. Red, then white, then a kind of gray only found on people who have just realized they've stepped on a rake. This is impossible. It's very possible, she said. Your board never renewed the lease. You mailed a check. No one cashed it. No one replied. You never followed up. And when the trust decided to sell, I made an offer. Jill stammered. Why didn't you? Why didn't I what? Margaret asked. Tell you I was exercising my legal right to acquire something your board neglected for nearly 70 years. Tyler spoke up. But we use that lake. We host events. We have the fall paddleboard race, the summer movie night. I know, she said. I've attended them. They were lovely. Then why shut it down? Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. You fine me for fishing. No one responded. You sent a letter threatening legal action over a cane pole and a sunfish. On a lake you never cared to secure. On land you didn't bother to understand. You assumed that your rules were law, and that I was someone you could intimidate. She took a step closer. But I read the fine print. Another pause. I'm sure you'll want to consult legal counsel, she added. You'll find the sale was clean, fully documented. I've also filed with the county assessor's office, so your insurance bond for waterfront liability will need to be updated or dissolved. Brenner looked like he might be sick. Margaret turned gently. Oh, and before you send anyone to remove that sign, I've already spoken to the sheriff's office. The lake is now posted. Anyone caught on it without written permission will be cited for trespassing. She smiled, not cruelly, just evenly, calm, like a woman who had chosen her words and waited for her moment. They watched her walk away, unable to respond. The silence behind her was thick. She didn't turn back. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. That evening, the HOA sent out an email blast. Margaret read it while watering her houseplants. Important community notice. Due to an unexpected change in ownership, Magnolia Lake is no longer available for recreational use by Larkspur Glen residents. The HOA board is currently investigating legal options and asks all residents to refrain from accessing the lake area until further notice. She chuckled softly and returned to pruning her herbs. The next morning, she went for a walk around the neighborhood. Faces turned. Some smiled, some avoided eye contact. A few stopped her to ask, "Is it true?" She nodded and said, "Yes, it is." Some congratulated her. Others tried to coax answers. She gave none. But later that week, as she watched a family with 3 kids walk down the trail and then stop, disappointed, at the sign, she knew the moment had come. Because while revenge was satisfying, restoration was better. And Margaret didn't just own the lake. She was about to decide who it really belonged to. By the end of the second week, the sign had become a landmark. People whispered about it during evening strolls, circled it during morning jogs, and snapped photos from the edge of the newly drawn property line like they were standing at the gates of some strange museum of neighborhood justice. Some posted online, calling it Lake Gate. Others scribbled passive-aggressive notes on the HOA message board. One anonymous user called her a tyrant. Another, a hero. Margaret didn't read any of it. She didn't need to. She'd lived long enough to know the difference between noise and consequence. The HOA board, predictably, responded with a mixture of denial and quiet panic. At first, they posted notices on every neighborhood bulletin, claiming they were in discussions with legal counsel to explore easement rights. Then they hosted an emergency meeting in the clubhouse, which Margaret did not attend, despite receiving 3 hand-delivered invites. She wasn't interested in hearing them talk. They'd done enough of that already. Instead, she walked the edge of the lake just before sunset, listening to the wind. The air was different now, not just because it was technically hers, but because the community had realized something unspoken. The rules weren't built on law. They were built on assumption. An assumption had met its match in a cardigan and boots. By the 3rd week, reality sank in. Parents who once let their kids paddle after school now steered them toward other distractions. Dog walkers who used to let their labs splash at the shallow end kept to the path. The lake sat quiet, not out of respect, but unease. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't want submission. She wanted recognition. The HOA president, Howard Brenner, came by in person one afternoon. He stood at the edge of her driveway like a salesman who knew the door would be slammed in his face. "I want to talk," he said as she clipped her rose bushes. "You're talking," she replied without looking up. He sighed. "I'll be frank, Margaret. The board, we're overwhelmed. We didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said, standing upright and wiping her gloves clean. "But this decision, it's hurting people. Families. You've made your point. Can't we find some middle ground?" She looked at him then. Not unkindly. Just completely. "Middle ground was never offered to me, Howard. Not when I was fined. Not when I asked for clarification. Not when I was told, in writing, that I was subject to legal action." He shifted, uncomfortable. "That was policy." "No," she said. "That was arrogance." He didn't argue. Because what could he say? He glanced toward the lake. "It's such a shame. That lake's meant for everyone." She tilted her head. "No, Howard. It was meant for whoever you thought deserved it." And then she walked past him, back to her porch, back to her quiet. That night, she sat by her fireplace with a notebook. She flipped back through the community's plat map, her deed, and the terms she'd negotiated with the Ridgeview Trust. There was no restriction, no HOA clause, no limitation. The lake was hers. Fully, legally, and now entirely. But that didn't mean it had to stay closed. Margaret didn't believe in revenge for revenge's sake. She believed in clarity, in teaching by consequence. And they had learned. The hard way. So now, she was going to decide what came next. On the first Saturday of February, a new sign went up, not on HOA property, but at the far end of the lake where the boundary line met the county park trailhead. No board members were there to see it installed. No one from the neighborhood committee even noticed for hours. It was made of polished oak, hand-carved letters, and sealed against the elements. Public access pier. Open to all. No permit required. No association governance. Property of Emmy Whitlow. Fish with respect. Leave no trash. Bring whoever you wish. Gate stays open. There was no grand unveiling. No ribbon cutting. Just a quiet path cleared to a newly installed dock. Wide, safe, with 4 sturdy benches and a cleaning station for caught fish. Margaret had paid for it herself. Through a local veteran-run construction outfit. No logo. No fanfare. The pier opened that day. And by sunset, there were 3 kids dangling their feet off the edge, casting lines. A couple on bikes leaned their helmets against the railing. An older man with a cane sat on a bench and read a paperback as the wind stirred the pages. No one knew who had made it possible, but they felt the difference. Back in the neighborhood, the HOA board was stunned. Margaret had cut off their access, then given it back, but only to those who didn't expect it, demand it, or feel entitled to it. It was a public message written in action, not words. You lost the privilege, but the people never lost the right. Brenner sent another letter. This one had a markedly different tone. "Dear Ms. Whitlow, on behalf of the Larkspur Glen HOA, we would like to formally apologize for our prior correspondence and actions. It is now clear that the lake was never truly ours to govern, and we regret the enforcement taken against your peaceful use of the space. We acknowledge the incredible generosity of your new pier and would like to discuss the possibility of community partnership in the future. Sincerely, Howard Brenner, HOA President." Margaret read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the same drawer as the fine that started it all. She didn't reply, not out of spite, out of certainty, because if they truly understood now, if they really meant it, they wouldn't need her to say anything. The lake spoke louder than she ever would. The following weekend, the local paper published an article titled, "A Quiet Woman, a Closed Lake, and the Pier That Welcomes All." It was well written, thoughtful. Margaret didn't sit for an interview, but she allowed the journalist to walk the grounds. She asked only one thing. "Don't center me. Center the space." And that's exactly what he did. The piece went mildly viral. Not explosively, but it reached the right people. Neighbors, small towns, older women who clipped it and taped it to their fridges. People who'd been silenced, dismissed, fined, ignored. They read about a woman who didn't yell or stomp. She just watched, waited, and then rewrote the map. By March, the HOA had resigned itself to the new order. They trimmed hedges, repainted crosswalks, and learned, awkwardly, to lead without authority. At meetings, they started saying residents instead of members. They voted to stop citing for flowerpot violations and to rewrite the entire enforcement section of the bylaws. Margaret watched it all from a distance. Not with malice, with hope, because sometimes power didn't need to roar. It needed to show you what silence could build, and what arrogance would always lose. Spring arrived like a whisper, the kind of spring that didn't burst through the door, but instead slipped quietly under it, with warmer mornings, softer breezes, and daffodils that pushed through soil still firm from winter. Magnolia Lake mirrored that change perfectly. The water, once quiet out of fear, now shimmered with life. Dragonflies returned. Kids squealed from the public pier as they watched their lines dip, hoping for bluegill or bass. Couples strolled the edges again, pausing not at the HOA bulletin board, but at the sign. The sign, the one that had rewritten everything. Gate stays open. It didn't just welcome. It declared. It reminded. That access is not always about permission. Sometimes, it's about principle. Margaret Whitlow didn't need to watch it happen. But she did. Not out of pride, but out of responsibility. She understood that actions ripple, especially the quiet ones. She sat most mornings on her porch with a thermos of tea, Audrey the cat perched at her feet, watching as joggers nodded toward her lawn, as newcomers pointed toward the lake and whispered stories they'd heard. They didn't always know she was her, the woman who'd bought the lake, banned the neighborhood, and then turned around and gave the best piece of it to the people who'd never felt they belonged. But that was exactly how she wanted it. The attention had died down. The article from the local paper had become one of those things people brought up with a slight chuckle. "Remember that HOA lake story?" they'd say, shaking their heads with a mix of admiration and disbelief. But the impact? That didn't fade. Children drew crayon pictures of Ms. Whitlow's dock and taped them to classroom walls. An art student from the university painted the lake from the view of the public pier and sent it to her with a note that simply said, "I never knew what welcome felt like until I saw that sign." The county quietly renamed the trail marker at the lake's north entrance to Whitlow Path, citing it as a gesture of gratitude for her commitment to public space. Margaret didn't protest, but she did smile. Because all of it, every changed policy, every lowered voice, every nod of respect, it wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Even the HOA changed. Slowly, then all at once. The board, after being completely reshuffled during the next election cycle, took on a different tone entirely. Less enforcement, more service. The new president, a woman named Nancy Ruiz, formerly one of Margaret's most outspoken critics, stopped by one day with a homemade lemon cake. Margaret raised an eyebrow when she opened the door. "I'm not here to fight," Nancy said, lifting the foil-covered pan with both hands. "Just to say thank you for showing us where we went wrong, and for showing me, personally, how I'd been walking through this world with blinders on." Margaret took the cake, said nothing, but left the door open just long enough for Nancy to know she was welcome to return. By early May, the lake had become a case study. A civic professor at the university featured it in his course, Unlikely Power and Property Law. A legal blog published an analysis titled, "The Woman Who Outmaneuvered an HOA with a Fishing Rod." Margaret ignored all requests for interviews. But one morning, while pruning her hydrangeas, she paused and smiled when a neighbor's kid biked past and shouted, "Thanks for the lake, Ms. Whitlow." She waved back, soft and subtle, because some victories don't live in headlines. They live in memory. On Memorial Day weekend, a modest celebration was held at the public pier. Not by Margaret's design, by the community's. No one sent her an invitation, but they didn't need to. She heard the laughter, the strumming of an acoustic guitar, the crack of soda cans, and the scent of grilled corn. At twilight, she walked the back path alone, hands in her pockets, boots crunching softly against gravel. As she approached the pier, she saw it. A small crowd gathered, most sitting cross-legged on blankets or benches. Someone had lit lanterns. Others had brought battery-operated candles that flickered along the railing. At the center of the gathering stood a girl, maybe 13. Her fishing rod rested beside her on the bench. Her voice trembled but held firm as she read from a piece of notebook paper. "They told me I couldn't fish here. They told me it wasn't for me. But then someone stood where I am now and said, 'Yes, it is.'" She didn't ask permission. She didn't argue. She just changed everything with silence, then opened the door for all of us. Margaret stood back in the shadows. Let the words pass over her like wind. She didn't need credit. She had never wanted credit. Just clarity. That same evening, after the families had left and the dock had returned to its peaceful home, Margaret walked to the sign one last time. The original one. The one she had placed in winter when the air was still sharp and the hurt still raw. Private lake. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Owner, Emmy Whitlow. HOA access revoked as of January 1st, 2025. It had served its purpose. It had done its job. But now it was time for something else. She knelt, pulled the bolts from the post, and laid the sign gently in the grass. In its place, she affixed a new plaque, brass, small, and elegant. Welcome to Magnolia Lake. Private owner, Emmy Whitlow. Public trust. Open use. No board. No permission. No exclusions. Stewardship is earned through kindness. Respect the water. Respect each other. Fish freely. She stepped back. Took a breath. The air was warmer now. Lighter. The kind of air that told you spring was real and summer wasn't far behind. Margaret stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked the long way home. Not for the view, for the sound, the soft lapping of lake water, the quiet laughter in the distance, and the faint, familiar trill of a red-winged blackbird echoing in the trees. A sound she'd known all her life. But now, for the first time in a long time, it didn't just sound like freedom. It sounded like belonging. And that, after all, was the legacy she'd chosen. Not the fine, not the sign, not even the record-breaking buyout. But the moment they all learned that silence, when paired with strength, can change the world in a single sentence. Gate stays open.